With the release of Dominion, there has been some concern on social media that Age of Sigmar 3rd edition is going to go grimdark. While I have attempted to understand this criticism, I can't help but think that going grimdark will be more of a help than a hindrance to new fans looking to get invested into the AOS lore. The main contention appears to be around a shift in narrative away from a valiant defence by the forces of order against the forces of chaos and death towards a campaign of incursion and conquest into the lands held by the forces of destruction. It has been suggested that this narrative shift threatens to move the Age of Sigmar away from a noblebright aesthetic towards one that would encourage socially problematic lore elements. This noblebright aesthetic comes from a literary subgenre that has been popularised in recent years by YA science fiction such as Hunger Games or the Divergent series. It is used as a shorthand to outline a story where an inspirational hero is thrust into a conflict to liberate a population from an oppressive regime. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong with noblebright fiction. Star Wars, the original trilogy, is perhaps the most popular franchise to rely on this noblebright aesthetic. However, in my opinion, noblebright only works well when it is situated within a dynamic and complex setting. And it is here that we encounter the key problem with AOS lore. The books so far have neither been dynamic nor reveal the complexities of the setting itself. Having listened to all of the audiobooks produced across the 2nd edition of Age of Sigmar, it is hard to escape the perception that each book has been produced as a media tie-in for each newly released army. From Neferata, the Dominion of Bones, to the End of Enlightenment, each story seems to depict an isolated leader, hero or general marshalling their troops against some incoming dark and evil foe. Nagash, the Undying King, and the Court of the Blind King are relatively different, focusing instead on the internal politics of particular armies, but are otherwise largely disconnected from the dreaded Necroquake, the key plot element of the 2nd edition. However, some good books do exist in this offering. Callus and Toll, the Silver Shard, and the Cursed City are exemplary Age of Sigmar stories. Yet they radically deviate from this noblebright aesthetic that has been established so far, and greatly incorporate grimdark fantasy into the story. Cursed City stands out to me as the best Age of Sigmar story to date, seemingly borrowing heavily from Bloodborne and Dark Souls to illustrate the hopelessness of a setting that has already fallen to monsters. Perhaps it is here that we find the major misconception about grimdark literature. It's not a genre that tells hopeless tales, rather the stories are about hope, courage and human resolve in spite of a hopelessly oppressive political regime. Our grimdark heroes will never overthrow evil, as evil is not personified by a single villain like Sauron, but rather our heroes can push back the darkness for a moment's reprieve by demonstrating that victory can be achieved against systematic oppressions. While such victories may ultimately prove Pyrrhic, such small victories illustrate how hope is eternal and that evil is not as omnipotent as it pretends. In grimdark stories, our heroes fight against nihilism itself and demonstrate where the weaknesses are in political systems designed to break down the human spirit. This is something we see quite clearly in the narratives of Bloodborne and Dark Souls. The story follows the player character going through repeated cycles of death and rebirth, attempting to overthrow the villain at the end, only for it to be revealed that we have just become a part of the cycle. And yet, rather than being disappointed at the tragic ending, the player themselves get to reflect on the challenges that they have overcome to get to that point. It is a bittersweet experience, which in itself is the truly distilled essence of grimdark. Another misconception of grimdark is to suggest that the aesthetic is used as an excuse for graphic depictions of violence which are somewhat unpalatable. And while there will always be an element of the sensational body horror to grimdark, Black Library authors have in recent years matured in their understanding of the grotesque and the malevolent, and this has helped develop a more rounded concept of corruption and villainy which shies away from macabre shock value. Slaanesh, for example, has transitioned from this embodiment of carnal desire towards being the personification of hubris and pride. The Warhammer 40k horror story, The Reverie, perhaps provides one of the best depictions of how the fall to Slaanesh has become more subtle, acting in part as a commentary on the psychosocial corruption of success, attention, and personal limitations. A Grimdark Age of Sigmar would ultimately benefit the setting by grounding the universe within the more tangible experiences of humans within the realms. Both Cursed City and The Reverie relies on the human characters to contextualise the fantastical politics, allowing the reader to understand both how oppressive the regime is and how the fall to darkness is well and truly believable. While the models of the Stormcast or the Lumineth or the Ideneth look impressive on the table, their socio-political contexts are so incredibly alien to readers that much of the books are dedicated to telling the reader how they function, rather than showing the reader how each of the different races differ from humans within the setting. This is where the 40k stories do an impressive job across the Horus Heresy books, as much as the dialogue between the characters help establish how Space Marines are motivated by incredibly human emotions, even if those emotions are amplified to superhuman degrees. While I do not expect Games Workshop to greenlight a 50-book series to help contextualise the Stormcast Eternals, I would like to see more stories based on a collection of reoccurring human characters to act as our guide into the setting. For me, Felix from the Gotrek and Felix books did this incredibly well to introduce the old fantasy setting. While it is interesting to see Gotrek transition into AOS, as the audiobooks are incomplete, it will be a while before I catch up. Callus and Toll were fantastic characters who seem to be intended to be replacements for Felix and Gotrek. However, as it has been several years since the last book was published, I do not expect further adventures from the Witch Hunters in this new realm. While I will continue listening to the Age of Sigmar audiobooks more to help me sleep than anything else, I can only remain optimistic that Black Library really indulge in the Grimdark to breathe life into the setting. Otherwise, I'll only really be getting excited for more Gotrek and Felix re-releases. Either way, I have been Invictor Lawstrom. Thank you for listening.